When talking about the hardest video games of all time, it may seem like an impossible task since what's considered hard is subjective and will vary from gamer to gamer. However, there are certain games that have earned a reputation for being some of the absolute most challenging experiences gamers have ever had. Now, why would somebody want to know what some of the hardest games are? Well, maybe you're looking for a challenge, maybe you want to pound your chest in victory if you've already beaten one of these games, or maybe you just want to feel comforted by the fact that you weren't the only one who thought these games were hard. To set some criteria for this video, let's say we're looking at challenge in terms of how hard it is to beat the game, and doing so on the standard difficulty. That way we're looking at the default experience, as intended by the game's designers, that most people remember a game by, as opposed to some of the higher difficulty settings that less people would have played through. Naturally, we're going to be looking at some NES games in this video, and what better game to start with than Ninja Gaiden. This game features a lot of the classic pain in the butt stuff that the hardest NES games had. Respawning enemies, getting knocked back when you're hit, pits of death, and my personal favorite, annoying enemy patterns. Ninja Gaiden is a really good game though, so a lot of us have been motivated to try to beat it. I think where a lot of the frustration comes from is when people don't keep moving. If you try to hold your ground and fight off all the enemies, you're just gonna keep re-triggering them to spawn again. You really gotta find a way to just keep moving in this game or else you'll get swarmed. Sometimes that's easier said than done though, because you still need to be very precise and careful in order to navigate your way through. As somebody who's reached the end of the game on multiple occasions, but never actually beaten it I should add, I can say that there are certain parts in the game where you get stuck on trying to figure out how to get past just a single enemy. And it's usually that they're just really hard to get past without being knocked into one of those death pits. The one spot I always get stuck at is on stage 6-2, and by that point I just don't have the energy to power through and figure it out. I just think, maybe I'll beat it the next time. I should mention that like a lot of NES games, you do get unlimited continues, so it's just a matter of when you give up, because you can always try again. This is one of the very few gracious acts of mercy that NES games will afford you. And yet the next NES game on my list doesn't even give you this. Battletoads. This is actually probably the one game I see mentioned more than any other game as the hardest game to beat. Besides being super difficult, it only gives you 3 continues, which is extremely unforgiving when you compare it to the standard of unlimited continues for the time. And just as a nice little touch when it comes to that, they don't even tell you how many continues you have left every time you go to the continue screen. So yeah, make sure you keep track of those continues. When it comes to the difficulty of this game, a lot of people will immediately point to the Turbo Tunnel stage, which is stage 3. That's definitely a challenging stage for sure, and it's served as a graveyard for many gamers who have tried their hand at this game, but even if you do get past stage 3, there are still 10 more stages to go. That's right, there are 13 stages in this game, well, depending how you count them. But my point is that it's a lot to get through. That is a ton. What makes it even more daunting is that the stages all really differ as far as the design goes, with a whole bunch of different mechanics you need to master. So you'll really need to spend some time figuring out and mastering all the different levels. This makes the lack of unlimited continues all the more unfortunate, since you'll likely have to restart the game from the beginning a lot. Of course, there are some very dedicated gamers who have beaten it, for example, longtime viewer of this channel and super gamer Jake Smith, but to anybody who hasn't and wants to try, all I can say is good luck. Now, of course, there are quite a few other NES games that people love to point to when it comes to this conversation, and everybody will have their different choices, but if we can fast forward things a bit, I'd like to talk about Dark Souls, because this is a game that I see mentioned a whole bunch when it comes to hard games. You see, I actually don't think it's one of the hardest games ever made. Sure, it's got a lot of challenge to it, but I think the majority of its reputation comes from the time it was released. You see, back in the day, just about every single game was pretty hard, but as time went on, games became much more forgiving and hand-holding overall in order to draw more gamers in. Dark Souls has a lot of the design sensibilities of retro games, being a lack of giving the player direction, actual consequences for dying that are substantial, and no guarantee that just because you're playing the game, you'll see the end of it. Now, it's a revolutionary game for bringing difficulty back into video games, absolutely, but is it the hardest video game ever made? Nope. It just has a reputation because it caught a lot of unsuspecting gamers off guard who are used to video games playing in a different way. And there's plenty of people who would agree with me, although this is just an opinion, albeit a popular one. Cuphead is another game that people like to mention, and again, I'd say that while this game is challenging, it's still on par with a lot of games from back in the day. There's also plenty of other less mainstream games out there that maybe everybody hasn't heard of, but they're still incredibly difficult to beat. One that immediately jumps to mind isn't so much a single game, but rather an entire genre I'm actually quite fond of, and that would be shoot 'em ups. For obvious reasons, these are incredibly difficult games that require a lot of precision, but the trouble with evaluating these games is what exactly constitutes actually beating the game. The die-hard fans of these games often don't really value much other than running through the entire game on a single credit, and even further than that, you have to loop through the game multiple times as per the game's design. There's also probably plenty of other more obscure games that I'm sure are really challenging, but I've just never played them myself. And maybe depending how much traction this video gets, we'll get to see some of those games listed down in the comments. However, for this video, what I'd like everybody to put down in the comments is which game is the hardest game they've ever beaten or simply played. The funny thing is, once you've beaten a game, it probably doesn't seem as hard as it did before you beat it, right? Well, try to be objective in your answers. Also, beating a hard game is always a really personal thing, isn't it? I mean, every time I've ever celebrated beating a hard game, I can tell you that there was definitely nobody who cared about it as much as I did. Alright, so be sure to leave those comments down below, and I will see ya in the next video.